Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute for our discussion today on Brazil's runoff election scheduled for this Sunday, October 26, and also a welcome to those who are watching online. My name is Jose Cardenas, and I will serve as the moderator of this discussion. We have about 1 hour to discuss the election, so we want to be judicious with our time and jump right in. Before we begin, though, if I could just ask everybody, please recheck your cell phones so that we don't have any interruptions in our discussion. Now, for all its continental size, its population of almost 200 million people, world's 7th largest economy, right here in our own hemisphere, Brazil has been somewhat of an enigma to many policymakers and observers here in Washington. We just never seem to get it, to understand it properly. And why our two countries, the United States and Brazil, have never really been able to combine our comparative advantages and strengths into a truly mutually productive and enduring relationship. That is why we're fortunate enough today to have a particularly insightful panel of experts to help us understand the country and the implications of this Sunday's election. Specifically, what the election may mean for Brazil's future and for U.S.-Brazil relations. The election certainly has had no shortage of intriguing storylines. The death of a candidate in a plane crash, unfortunately. The dramatic rise and fall of his successor, Marina Silva. And the clash today between the incumbent Dilma Rousseff of the Workers' Party, she's a protege of former President Lula, and Aécio Neves of the PSDB, the center-right Brazilian Social Democracy Party, who himself who comes from his own storied political background. Will this be a consequential election for Brazil? Will it mean a possible break for the low-risk, low-reward Brazilian policies of the past? Can it be a catalyst for a restructuring of the internal economy away from heavy state involvement? Could it lead to a new international orientation that isn't constrained by notions of developing world solidarity? For those answers and more, we'll turn to our panelists. Each of them will give a few minutes of opening remarks, and then we will get to the question and answer session as quickly as possible. Our first speaker is Roger Noriega, who is a visiting fellow here at AEI and founder and managing director of the consulting firm Vision Americas. Roger served as Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs and as the U.S. Ambassador to the Organization of American States during the George W. Bush administration. Roger?
Thank you very much, Jose. Thank you all for coming. Thank the other panelists for joining us today. This is a pretty well-informed audience, I'm sure, but I'll give you a little bit of context, discussion of the candidates, their backgrounds, their program, the campaign, and then we can move on to the other panelists' insight and questions. Signs of economic stagnation, in point of fact, recession in Brazil could not have come at a worse time for Dilma Rousseff, who is seeking re-election to a second four-year term. It also comes against the backdrop of simmering popular dissatisfaction in the country, maybe the classic crisis of rising expectations. According to midsummer polls, skepticism among voters about Dilma's track record and her policies appeared to open the door for a challenge from Social Democrat and pro-business candidate Aécio Neves. This was presaged during the first round when, as Jose alluded, Marina Silva, a maverick environmentalist candidate, really drew a lot of attention to this race. What was expected to be Dilma easily cruising to re-election became a real challenge. which was eventually beaten back. But at the same time, it attracted people who were on the sidelines of this process, maybe people who were disaffected from the elections altogether, to take another look at it and to consider some out-of-the-box thinking, unconventional thinking about how to get that economy going again. The outcome of elections in South America's most populous country and largest economy may very well depend on whether Dilma is able to convince Brazilians who are anxious these days that more of the same is less risky than the free market vision offered by Aécio Neves. Will voters, in other words, base their decision on who is most likely to maintain a social safety net in the short run, or who is likely to jumpstart economic growth in the longer term? Dilma Rousseff was the first woman president of Brazil, sworn in January 2011. She was Minister of Mines and Energy, and then Chief of Staff to President Lula da Silva, very popular president. She was raised in a middle-class family in Belo Horizonte. After the military coup in 1964, became associated with various leftist organizations, and during the military dictatorship, she was jailed and tortured in the early 1970s. As president, she has remained faithful to the economic and social policies of her predecessor, touting an unprecedented, quote, peaceful social revolution, and dedicated her campaign to maintaining those achievements. She has certainly doubled down on this government-led economy. On the campaign trail, she has pledged massive new spending on government anti-poverty programs, as well as health, education, and housing. Very explicitly, in May, she announced a 10% increase in the social welfare transfer programs for the poor, well above the rate of inflation, and she's also pledged to dedicate 10% of GDP spending to education, although that education system really is not producing the kinds of meaningful outcomes that one would expect. But she's not talking about reform, she's talking about more resources. The average spending, for example, in that area is about 4 to 6% in the region. Aécio Neves is an economist, senator, congressman, and governor from Minas Gerais. When he became governor, that state was practically bankrupt with an annual deficit of $270 million. He implemented what he's described as a management shock. He modernized procurement, reformed the bureaucracy, and cut spending. It led Minas Gerais out of bankruptcy and ushered in a period of economic prosperity in that state, that important state. Dilma has challenged some of his accomplishments, particularly in the social area, in a series of debates in recent weeks. Neves has promised to continue these social programs, although he does not explain how he intends to do that while bringing government spending under control. He stresses the need to fight inflation and encourage job creation by making Brazil more attractive to investment and competitive in the global economy. He pledges to work with the United States and Europe to expand preferential trade opportunities. He's recently criticized Dilma for the ideological orientation of her foreign policy, which he says has constrained Brazil's ability to seize good opportunities in the world marketplace. About the campaign, frankly, Dilma got her job because of the popularity of her predecessor. He chose her, handpicked her, and saw that she was elected, and now is a chief asset of her reelection campaign. In point of fact, in the last several years, his record has been sort of a liability because of the work that he left undone. When he was elected, he charmed populists in and out of Brazil by expanding anti-poverty and anti-hunger programs, which his predecessors started and which have brought 40 to 50 million people out of poverty and into a burgeoning middle class. He also charmed the United States and the international markets by not being Hugo Chavez. He's a committed Democrat and has hewed to an orthodox macroeconomic policy. A friend of mine, Bill Perry, Brazilianist, observed at the time that Lula is showing what Brazil is capable of becoming when the government doesn't do stupid things. The problem is that Lula may have done a disservice to his successor by failing to do a few smart things along the way. For example, he didn't retool the economy, reforming the tax system, labor code, financial sector, and public education. Even after he won a mandate in a second re-election, he failed to undertake these reforms because he didn't have to, because they discovered these vast oil deposits in 2007, and because of the China-fueled commodity boom, which helped Brazil's economy. In a sense, Dilma is serving Lula's third term, and the party is over. Just as the campaign got underway, the economy slipped into a recession, and inflation fears stoked the anxiety of Brazilian voters. Government stimulus programs and so-called industrial policy, which we read about in history books, but which is part of the lexicon today of Brazilian policymakers, have driven up spending, but failed to stop the economic downturn. The state-owned oil company Petrobras, which was once a source of national competitiveness and pride, is actually a symbol of the country's problems today. Even with the prospects of vast new oil deposits, but Brazil's petroleum sector has underperformed and is used as a cash cow to the state to fund its social welfare programs. And in recent years, Brazil's energy sector has failed to attract the capital and technology that it needs to exploit these resources because of the nationalist ground rules that the government has imposed. As a result, Petrobras's production and productivity have both dropped, although the company has invested between $22 and $47 billion each year since 2008. Its productivity is actually only 5.5% greater than it was in that year. And on top of that, you now have the Petrobras kickback scandal, allegedly benefiting cronies of the ruling party. Dilma's opponents have argued that she is either part of that corruption or is a poor manager because she didn't stop it. Just 3 months ago, Dilma appeared to be headed to easy re-election. She probably should have seen this challenge coming. In 2013, mid-2013, Brazilians in a spontaneous way took to the streets of its major cities and protested against the government's policies. I think this is part of the anxiety of people being pulled out of the middle class, out of poverty into the middle class, having their expectations for a higher quality of life sparked, but recognizing that the government does not have the policies in place to create the jobs needed to sustain that quality of life. And I explained a bit of the reasons why. Dilma's policies are tremendously unpopular, and the polls bear that out. And she's, rather than focusing on those and defending those policies, she's associated herself with Lula's tenure and argued that Aécio Neves wants to take the country and put it under the knife of the IMF, and also accusing him of other corruption and other things. To conclude very quickly, most recent polls show a technical tie. She has an edge, and in some of those polls that are reliable polls, she has a bit of an edge, but 4%, but technical tie. And Michael Barone can tell us what that means. And she has, most importantly, driven up Neves's negatives, the rejection rate, through this negative campaign, and that may keep some of the people who are on the sidelines of the process from actually casting a vote and deciding that they'd rather stay home on election day. 143 million Brazilians are registered to vote, have a right to vote. They will do so on touchpads in every corner of that country, touchscreen voting, and we should know the results of that presidential election by the end of the day on Sunday. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. Thank you for that excellent scene setter to take from Roger's presentation, giving us the broader context and perhaps a little bit more into the weeds of the electoral system. We have our second speaker, who basically really needs no introduction to anybody who has maybe spent more than a week in Washington. He is one of our country's foremost political analysts. Officially, Michael Barone is senior political analyst for the Washington Examiner, and also a resident fellow here at AEI, as well as a contributor to Fox News Channel and the co-author of the indispensable Almanac of American Politics. What you may not know about Michael is that he's also a keen observer of foreign elections, having reported on recent elections in Great Britain, Italy, Russia, and Mexico. Michael?
Thank you very much, Jose. As you say, I fancy myself, or am portrayed by others, as an expert on elections. At least that's an area of specialty for me. I don't consider to be an expert on Brazil, but it's a country that has taken more of my attention in recent years, and I'm fascinated. And I'd like to start off just by putting this in a broader world perspective. The Brazilians voted in the Primeiro Turno, the first round, on October 5th. More than 100 million people voted. This is the third election in the world this year in which more than 100 million people voted. That's pretty awesome. We had back in more than 790 million people, more than 3/4 of a billion, have cast ballots in India, in Indonesia, and now in Brazil. And presumably we will have another about 104 million people actually cast ballots, since there's compulsory voter. Others come in and cast blank ballots, or simply don't vote, or spoil their ballots. And it's a considerable achievement. 75 years ago, India and Indonesia were colonies. They weren't electoral democracies. 200 years ago, Brazil was. It was only 125 years ago that Brazil abolished slavery, one of the last nations in the world to do so, and interestingly, to popular acclaim. They didn't have a civil war. They had celebrations in the street. Brazil had, as Roger noted, military dictatorship from 1965 to 84. There were some elections there with limitations on political parties, and the military regime basically established an official party and an opposition party. And in these other countries, in India, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi declared a state of emergency, ruled by decree in 1975 through 77. One of the interesting things she did then, and tells us something about where you can have valid polls or not, she conducted a poll before lifting the military emergency about how she would do in an election. And it said, "You're going to do great, Indira. They love you," and so forth. Then they held the election. She lost. One of the things that told me at the time was that when you have coercive government, that polls may not be as reliable as they are when you have free electoral democracy. Often kind of ragged at the seams, with some corruption, some irregularities, and so forth. Indonesia, they had a new order guaranteeing that the ruling party would win all elections between 1977 and 97. But they've all had free and fair elections this year, and interestingly enough, for Americans who look at the different procedures, mechanical procedures we have for voting in the 50 states and District of Columbia, and the disputes about them. You go up to New York City, in many ways the world's greatest city, and they use voting machines they've been using for 60 years. Brazil, as Roger pointed out, has touchpads. India has now setting up a system for biometric identification of the more than 1 billion people in India. Think of the obstacles of that. In effect, these countries are kind of leapfrogging us in technology. We're stuck with the stuff that we had in 1959, just as you are when you go to an airport in New York. You're stuck with 1959's most advanced architecture and technology. And Brazil is leapfrog. So we will know the results from the 34 states in the Federal District of Brazil within 5 hours. It takes 5 weeks to tabulate all the results for California. Now, of course, there are, physical obstacles. California is a big state and everything, but, and there are differences in the standard of living. But hey, those obstacles are greater in Brazil. There's something wrong with this picture, and what's wrong with it is not what's wrong in Brazil, but what's wrong in California, and why we can't have election results in less than 5 weeks. Maybe we would do better to go to the UK, where they have paper ballots, and basically most of the results are in by 5 o'clock in the morning. You have a 24-hour wait period in Britain. In any case, pretty awesome. 790 million people around the world casting ballots in free elections. One of the things we see, if you go back and read philosophical critiques of democracy, why, including the Founding Fathers, a purely democratic system was feared by them. One idea was that, well, the poor majority will use it just to grab the money and property of the rich minority. I think the answer, and these three countries tell us something about that, is it ain't necessarily so. We're seeing a debate in Brazil, as Roger said, about the balance between market forces and government. Most of us in this room will instinctively tend to favor one side of that debate or the other, without perhaps knowing all the details, but thinking we have a pretty good idea which side we would be on. But it's a debate that is within certain levels, certain parameters that don't include a lot of shocking things. The second thing I'd notice about Brazil is that as I read the numbers, the country seems to be developing something resembling a two-party system. Now, I know that when you look at the legislators in the two houses of Congress in Brasilia or in the state capitals, party identification switches a lot. Voters may be fickle. Brazilian politicians have, switched parties for reasons of political advantage and so forth. And you do have multiple candidates and three serious candidates in the first round of this election. After the death of Eduardo Campos in that plane crash on August 13th, we saw the polls oscillate a lot. I mean, Campos had been getting between 7 and 13%. Marina, and Brazilians, as I understand, tend to refer to their politicians by first name. It's not considered disrespectful. Marina jumped up to 34% in the polls, even with Dilma, with Aécio in third place. A lot of movement, and of course, a kind of shocking and unanticipated fact circumstance. But when you look at the actual results, they look a lot like 2010. Basically, Marina was running as a candidate in her own right in 2010. She got 19% of the vote. This year, 21%. In 2010, Jose Serra, the candidate of the PSDB, received 33%. This time, Aécio, the candidate of the PSDB, received 34%. The biggest difference was Dilma. She got 47% in the first round. She almost came pretty close to the 50% that would have resulted in her election without a second round runoff. This time she was in 42% rounded off. Basically, if you want to do a mechanical analysis, her percentage slipped 5.32%. You have a wonderful website on Folha de São Paulo, which you can, Elections 2014, you can get the results down to the city level, the municipality, not only the state results, but the municipality. Well, if you subtract 5.32% from her percentage in the 2010 runoff, you get 50.73% of votes cast for candidates. That's pretty close to 50%. And as I look at the polls that have been running more or less daily, they tend to point in the same direction, a very close election. The third point I make, sharp regional differences in Brazil. Dilma won 60% in this October 5th in the Northeast, 51% in the Amazon, which cast about a third of the votes. This is the lower income area. You've got a lot of very low income people. It's going for the PT candidate, the party of Lula and Dilma. And some of those states, in the first years after the dictatorship, sort of went for the locally prominent families and things. Now they seem to be in with the PT. The four southern states, São Paulo, Paraná, Santa Catarina, and Rio Grande do Sul, together cast about 37% of the vote. This is an economically much more advanced area. They voted, Dilma won only 30% of the votes in those areas. That was significantly down from 2010. And one of the interesting things is that Brazil's regional divisions seem to be upside down from those we see in the United States. Our biggest city, New York City, casts an overwhelming Democratic Party vote. Brazil's biggest city, Sao Paulo, went for Aécio and Marina. Dilma finished third with about 28% of the vote. And we're talking about a municipality of something like, 8 million people, and so forth. What we're seeing here, that's everybody in Sao Paulo is not rich, okay? It's not just a question of professional, high-income class, inherited wealth. What you're seeing there, I think, is something like it's Walmart shoppers. It's the people who buy appliances at Casas de Bahia, and where the prices are all quoted in terms of monthly payments, that kind of consumer credit. It's upwardly mobile people who may have come from rural areas who are living in what to our eyes do not look like really middle-class neighborhoods at all. They're upwardly mobile. It reminds me of America in the 1920s, of America in the early years just after World War II, where people were buying appliances that they'd never dreamed they'd have on the installment plan and moving upwards. These people are more on the side of the market in terms of the disputes between these two candidates, between market forces and government forces. The people in the Northeast are more in line with the government side of that argument. You've got the country, even in the Northeast though, the cities are more PSDB. The countryside is where you see 80% going for PT in those areas that are or are not far removed from subsistence farming. So it's an interesting pattern. Seems to me I sure wouldn't bet $1 on my confidence in who's going to win this election. It seems like a very interesting choice. And in some ways, it's awesome that we're seeing this kind of a contest in a place where 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 25 years ago, we would not have confidence of seeing a democratic choice being exercised by 100 million people.
Thank you, Michael. Our third speaker is David Rogas. David is president of David Rogas and Associates, a business development group with offices here in Washington and Brazil. He is a former senior foreign service officer, as well as an officer in the U.S. Navy. Much of his work focuses on Brazil, where he lived for 8 years as a diplomat and naval officer, including 4 years with the Brazilian Navy. And we're going to ask David to talk a little bit about the consequences of the election for Brazil's international orientation. David?
Thanks very much, Jose. And thank you, Roger and Michael, for really great presentations, really setting the tone. I have really an easy task here, and it's simply to assess what the state of U.S.-Brazil relations would be under a new Dilma regime or administration or an Aécio administration. And it is very easy. Under Dilma, it will be more of the same. A foreign policy and a foreign policy oriented toward the United States that is based on ideology. Under Aécio, the foreign policy and the relationship with the United States would be pragmatic, oriented toward improving not just the relationship, but the economic and the commercial relationship, with the goal, obviously, of improving Brazil's situation. An Aécio administration would abandon the ideological approach of the PT and deal with the world as Brazilian economic and commercial interests dictate. You wouldn't see, for example, the financing of the port of Mariel in Cuba under an Aécio administration. Although in reading the interviews that Aécio's principal foreign affairs advisor, former ambassador here in the United States, Rubens Barbosa, there's only one area where I see some tension between the United States and Brazil, but I suspect that under Aécio that tension would be very much mitigated, and that is with Cuba, with Brazil continuing to lobby for the dropping of the U.S. embargo against Cuba. Now, I'm forced to comment a little bit on some of the remarks of Michael. The fear that with democratic elections in a country like Brazil, the poor majority would use the opportunity to steal the wealth of others. I said this is an exaggerated concern, and there's no evidence of that. And I agree that it's not a question of stealing, but I do think that the elections have come down to the support of a dependent class, a class of people that have become dependent on the government and wanting to continue the support of the government. And the fear that with Aécio, that support would be eliminated or diminished, even though he has underscored that he would not make any changes in that regime. But I also celebrate these elections. I remember in the waning years of the military regime when I was serving in Rio de Janeiro in the consulate, we were having an election night reception at the consulate general, that is for American elections here in the United States. And it was a great party, great festivity, red, white, and blue, and great food and everything, and there were Brazilians and Americans. And I said to a Brazilian friend of mine, I said, you know, we Americans have great saudades. We really miss our elections. And he turned to me and said, we Brazilians miss elections too. So things have changed dramatically. Now, for the best indication of what direction relationships with the United States would take under Aécio, it's simply a matter of reading the very public and very frequent statements of Rubens Barbosa. I don't think Aécio himself has much experience. Well, I know he doesn't have much experience in foreign affairs and certainly in the bilateral context either, but he is depending heavily on Rubens Barbosa. And the speculation is that Rubens Barbosa would become the foreign minister under an Aécio administration. Perhaps he would, instead of becoming foreign minister, might assume the position currently held by the ideologue Marco Aurelio Garcia. So I would see a dramatic change in the relationship between the United States and Brazil under Aécio. Some people will say, no, it will be more the same. You can't overcome that inertia, that lack of inertia. No, I don't believe that that is the case. Now, there was one other aspect, this question of Brazil turning into a two-party system. At the presidential level, it does look like that. But the Congress is another thing altogether. There are 32 parties, 513 members of the lower house. Aécio's party only has, 32 members of that? 32. There are, 32 parties, 54 members from Aécio's party, 200 evangelicals. The breakdown of the Brazilian Congress is a study unto itself. So no matter what the presidency does, it is beholding to patronage and bringing these different parties into the government. Of course, Aécio says that he will vastly reduce the number of cabinet positions in Brazil now. I forgot how many there are, 130? I don't remember, quite a few. And the types of reforms or changes under an Aécio administration in Brazil would be not only good for Brazil, but good for the bilateral relationship. I could see a free trade agreement between the United States and Brazil, implementation of a visa waiver program, which would come obviously along with a reduction in visa fees, a bilateral tax agreement, a bilateral investment agreement, an agreement on satellite launches and space cooperation. If you look at the at the press releases from the various meetings that occur, and whenever Obama and Rousseff have gotten together, which has not happened in quite a while, there are many, many references to dialogue. There's a dialogue on this, a dialogue on that. I think there's a dialogue on how to make Pounds casual. I'm not sure about that, but it would be in there. I think that with Aécio, even with this administration in the United States, we would see some concrete results from those dialogues. Now, the other part of the equation is what happens here in the United States in 2 years and what that new administration is like. If Aécio wins, I think we'll see a state visit very soon. If Dilma wins, it'll be a long time, I think, before she comes to Washington.
Thank you, David. Before we jump into questions and answers, I just wanted to make one comment based on David's presentation, and that is, ojalá, I certainly hope that there is the possibility of a re-engagement, a serious re-engagement with Brazil, because although I'm biased, having served in the Bush administration, we have gone, as in our bilateral relationship, we have gone from a visit by President Lula with George Bush at Camp David, which my former boss at the National Security Council, Dan Fisk, remembers well, to the President of Brazil declining a visit for myriad reasons, a state visit to Washington. We have some fine young people with microphones to bring to you if you have a question. That gentleman right there, please identify yourself, and we will try to move quickly so we can get to everybody that has a question. Sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Jose Miguel Pulido. I work for Mitsui & Co. I wanted to ask about the problem of governability. It might seem that whoever wins will have a very short honeymoon period because of the impending effects of the recession. It has not yet hit unemployment or real income. So I'd like to know, if Aécio wins, how much time does he have to take advantage of that to improve U.S.-Brazil relations? Thank you very much.
I think he has less than a year. I think that the task is daunting. And even with the best of will, it's going to be very, very difficult. Governability is a very big question, and especially with the composition of the Congress. So Aécio will have to move quickly. And if Dilma is reelected, I don't know what to expect. It would seem that she would have to change her economic team in order to pull Brazil out of recession and demonstrate that, in fact, the future is brighter, the economic future is brighter. So I think that your question is a good one. Governability, how much time? Not much.
Yeah, my observation is that in terms of U.S. relations, President Dilma canceled a state visit, a White House dinner, very formal thing, after revelations that the U.S. security agencies had been listening in on her. One of the things that's important in some of these relationships is the personal relationship between heads of government. My understanding is that President Bush and President Lula, despite coming seemingly from opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, had a pretty warm personal relationship. My theory is that it's because the landscape of Central Texas looks a lot like the landscape of around Brasilia. But the President Obama is not known for having warm personal relations with foreign leaders, and my impression is he basically at this point doesn't have much relationship with Dilma at all.
Well, yeah, it is a two-way street on U.S. relations. I mean, the people, I mean, I was in government at the time, Dan was there, but Dan and Jose will tell you that the people responsible for that very positive relationship were Lula and President Bush. I was going to say me. I was tempted to say me, but for a while there. But and that kind of presidential level engagement is really important. I tell my foreign friends, don't take it personally that President Obama doesn't relate to you, because he doesn't relate to U.S. senators very effectively either. and I hate to criticize, but I mean, it's a reality that's part of it. You have to have that personal level of engagement. One of the, on the how much time does he have in governability, I think one of the advantages, appreciable advantage that Neves has over Silva was that he was the governor. He was an executive. He was an effective executive who took on an important state in serious trouble and turned it around in significant ways, won re-election handily. He also knows the legislative process well, senator, congressman. So he's a political operator and has been since his youth. So, I mean, I would hope, I'm not going to tell those folks how to do things, but I would think really that they will have a strategy and know that they have to move with a certain clarity, specific objectives, an agenda, and very, very quickly, because 4-year term goes by very quickly. So I think he would have to take full advantage of whatever mandate he got fairly early on.
Gentlemen?
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Marcio Coimbra. I'm from Brazil. I'm a political correspondent for the Huffington Post Brazil and a fellow at the Institute of World Politics and National Security. My point is, we have in Brazil in a sense doesn't feel part of Latin America, and its Latin American neighbors don't see Brazil as part of Latin America, maybe because of languages, of many differences. International affairs was not a point discussed during this campaign. And I would like to hear from you if Neves, if he wins, do you see that as any influence in the region as a fresh start for a different kind of government? Do you think that Neves as president could influence countries like Argentina, Bolivia, or Venezuela to take the same road in international affairs?
My understanding is that Aécio has indicated an interest in copying or being more similar to the Pacific Trade Pact of those countries from Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile. My understanding is that, and others I think will know more, is that Dilma has gone, expanding Mercosur, the initial Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina thing, and including Venezuela in it. Current economic growth rates, the Pacific countries are doing better than the Mercosur countries. May or may not continue. But it seems like those are two different approaches that represent a real choice for the voters.
Yeah, I agree. Stark choices, actually. Tremendous difference, in my view. I think that Brazil will exhaust its patience with Argentina with an Aécio Neves government. I think that it will similarly look upon Venezuela in pragmatic rather than ideological terms. The ideology, the confluence of ideology is between Dilma and Maduro, and not between Brazil and Argentina. The Pacific, yes, there's been great speculation about reaching out to the Pacific countries, the Pacific Trade Alliance, I forgot exactly what it's called, but also toward the United States, and an abandonment of, and this is a very strong word, so I want to be careful, much less emphasis and much less concern about Mercosur. A willingness, as a matter of fact, a desire to negotiate trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements with other countries and with the EU, independent of what Mercosur interests are. So I think that it will be quite different. I also agree with you that foreign affairs has played virtually no role whatsoever in the election. That's absolutely correct. And so whoever wins will not win on the basis of a mandate to continue or to change foreign policy. And that's going to be pretty much left to the executive branch, the presidency, the palace, and the foreign ministry, which has been greatly demoralized over the past, 4 to 6 years.
Thank you, David. Barbara?
Barbara Bowie Whitman. I'm wondering, since I don't have any on the ground observations of any of these people as campaigners, how do you all evaluate Aécio as a campaigner? Is he good at it? I mean, people have said he's good at being an executive. Is he good at reaching people? Are they influenced by when he gets out? Does he have charisma? Is he grabbing votes?
Well, I've been watching this fairly closely, and I find them all more compelling campaigners than American campaigners, quite frankly. I think some of the ability to deliver a speech and really capture people's attention. My gosh, we should send our candidates down for boot camp with some of these people. But I think he is an effective campaigner. I mean, I think he's been very intelligent in how he's handled the Dilma attack. He turns it back pretty quickly. When she accuses him of wanting to cut social programs and criticizing his record, he says, this is a campaign of lies. American politicians don't like to say lies, at least. They don't. And she's become, I think she became president because Lula wanted her to be president. She's an effective, manager, I believe, but has constraints about the PT agenda. But I think, and she's been kind of comfortable on the attack. But I see in these recent debates that Neves gives back, counter punches very effectively. But I do think that the messages, the communication skills are there, reaching people is there, and I think he's been effective in turning the arguments around, talking about her record, saying, I'm not going to cut social programs. By the way, those social programs were established under presidents of my party, and the real platform for economic growth was the Economic Stabilization Plan, the real plan that was implemented by my people. So I think he marshals good information, is a very effective campaigner, and I think the question is how effective really she's been with her back to the wall in the last month.
Well, and I guess you can watch the last debate tomorrow night on Globo TV if you've got that on your cable system. The Portuguese might be a little difficult to penetrate for those of us who are not Lusophone.
Barbara, let me make a comment here. I don't know we'll know how effective he is on Sunday night, but there is something that's very interesting, and it's interesting to compare this to what's happened here in the United States. The use of social media in campaigning and how it relates to the economic level of the people who are voting for one or the other. Hits for the Aécio social media sites are more than double that for Dilma. And the question is, well, what does that mean? I'm not sure what it means, but later on maybe we will figure it out. I suspect that what it is that more people that support Aécio have the economic ability to access the internet and to be engaged in social media, which, by the way, has just taken off tremendously in Brazil. And it goes to the point about the whole touch screen and voting. I mean, the last time I voted in Virginia, which was last year, paper ballot, paper ballot, Fairfax County, paper ballot, Fairfax County. This is one of the most affluent counties in the United States. But this goes back, and someone said leapfrog. Brazil has leapfrogged on technology. They did it on telephones. Now, I think it was the first country in the world to have more cell phones than landlines. People were just tired that the landlines were horrible. But there was a horrible infrastructure of landlines in Brazil, so when cell phones became an accessible technology, everybody jumped onto that because there was no inbred infrastructure which kept the cell phones from taking off. During the years of hyperinflation in Brazil, you know, Brazilians who had any money at all put money in the overnight dollar market. Overnight, literally. When you got paid on a Friday, you took all of your cruzeiros at that time and you put it in an overnight dollar market. And you checked on it on Saturday. You checked on it on Sunday. Well, there was no market on Sunday, but on Monday. You only took out as much money as you needed for that day because the inflation was so tremendous.
They were banking in the U.S.
Well, no, they were banking it in Brazil, about in dollar and dollar bonds or dollar markets. But what this did was it inculcated in the Brazilian middle class a need to be immediately aware of what you had, what your accounts looked like. And so it was an easy jump to move into electronic banking. You walk into a bank now in Brazil, you're lucky if you see one cashier. You'll find 12, 15 ATM machines. That's a bank branch in Brazil compared to here. You walk into a bank here and you're still dealing with cashiers. But Brazilians are very much in the forefront of electronic devices for voting, for banking, and social media. So it'll be interesting to see how effective each party is in promulgating their positions by way of social media and the effect that that has in the end.
Thank you, Dave. Gentleman right here, and then the gentle lady over here.
Hi, my name is Gerardo Torres. I'm a correspondent for a Salvadoran newspaper called El Diario de Hoy and a research assistant in CSIS. I had one question. How decisive would the Petrobras scandal result in these elections? Because the Workers' Party had a similar corruption scandal in 2005 and Lula won the re-election.
Petrobras?
Well, I mean, what I'm told by my Brazilian friends is that it's dominated the campaign in certain ways, which is no surprise. I mean, what the scandal is essentially, or it was revealed right in the heat of this campaign, that Petrobras contracts were used as vehicles for kickbacks to politicians, and the person who ran the scheme named names. And so it has been reconfirmed all of the concerns about corruption, which are fairly widespread concerns that Brazilian people have about the system. And why isn't Petrobras working? Why isn't the government delivering the goods? You know, Ronald Reagan used to say, you should thank God you don't get all the government you pay for. In Brazil, they pay a lot of taxes, my friends. This is not Guatemala where you're paying 8% of GDP into the government. They're taking 34%, 35%, and they are not getting that back. If you look at just infrastructure, underspend on infrastructure investment. In a dramatic fashion where it constrains the ability of Brazilian agriculture, for example, just because they can't get their product to a port. And when they get to that port, the port doesn't work because it's larded over with the unions that run it in inefficient and corrupt ways. So this corruption is a systematic problem that the Brazilian people are very concerned with, and the Petrobras scandal puts it in very, dramatic fashion on the front pages every day.
Any other comments? Gentle lady here.
Thank you. My name is Mary Grace McGowan. I am international TV commentator. And my question follows your comments on Mercosur. Brazil is very limited by Mercosur. You all know that because one of the requirements, if they want to engage in foreign trade, they have to get the consensus of all the other members of Mercosur. And I think that was designed as an anti-US, anti-West politics. There is no question in my mind that that was the reason behind that. They also need to open up to foreign investment and make it easier for foreign investment to get into Brazil. It's a nightmare, and you may know if you want to do business with Brazil. And on the other hand, they became China's warehouse, and they seem contempt about that. So what would you advise Dilma about it? And I am I don't like it, but I think she's going to be reelected. So how would you pose this question to her, and how would you advise her? Thank you.
David, do you want to pick that one up?
If I understood your question, is how would you attempt to persuade Dilma to enter into, let's say, a bilateral or a free trade agreement? I don't know. That would be a tremendous challenge, because she would not be inclined to do that. As I said, under a Dilma administration, I think we'll see more of the same, and there will be an emphasis and a preference given to Mercosur. And those requirements in terms of obtaining a Mercosur consensus before entering into bilateral trade negotiations, that is manageable. It's a political question. Part of the problem with Mercosur is that it has turned into more of a political entity than a trade entity. It would not be up, in my view, to the United States or another power to try to convince Dilma or a Brazilian administration of the benefits. That is something that is really up to Brazilian business interest. How do you go about doing that in this political environment? And it's a real question, again, because this is not something that is on the table during these elections. It's the Bolsa Familia. It's so what for me. Brazilians are voting on personal economic decisions, situations. And so we're just going to have to wait to see what happens and then look for opportunities. Who benefits more? I mean, Brazil's a tremendous market for American companies. There's no question, for companies from anywhere. But who benefits more from open trade? Brazil does. And especially as Brazil is now moving into more of an assembly model for manufacturing, kind of like Embraer. You know, Embraer, the great export of airplanes. But Embraer imports tremendous amount of material to pull those airplanes together. And that's happening in other sectors in Brazil, like the automobile sector. So Brazil benefits from free and open trade. And it's Brazilians that are going to have to convince their administration to be more open. And there would be no convincing required with an Aécio Neves regime.
My observation on Brazil foreign policy is that foreign policy leaders of somewhat different, perhaps domestic points of view, view Brazil not as just another Latin American country, not as Western Hemisphere, with the implication that, of course, the biggest country in the Western Hemisphere should sort of take the lead. They view themselves as a world power, as a world country, and it's interesting to see the two different trade orientations here. But I would just say on Venezuela, I think what Dilma would say is that her approach to Venezuela is pragmatic, and the U.S. approach is ideological.
On Mercosur, Mercosur I don't think was an ideological or political project against the United States. It was an economic project really that served Brazil's interests, and the fact is it's outlived its usefulness to Brazil. And so, I mean, the other thing, let's be fair, when we were talking free trade area of the Americas, if you took the top tariffs that the United States imposed to foreign products, 6 or 7 top tariffs that we imposed, it included 5 of Brazil's principal exports. I mean, we can't, you know, we were preaching free trade and they were saying, you're kidding? Are you kidding? But the fact is we were also talking about, and President Bush made a public pledge to reduce all farm subsidies, for example. What he needed was help precisely from a country like Brazil, which spoke with credibility from the developing world, to work with us to lean on the Asians and the Europeans to do the same thing. So the Brazilians had a role to play in that. And I think the other thing is Itamaraty, which runs foreign policy and trade policy, and that's significant. Folks see things as a zero-sum game vis-a-vis the United States. And when we were able to change that equation and have a good relationship with President Lula, it was precisely because we worked around Itamaraty, around the bureaucracy. Now, Rubens Barbosa was a former U.S. ambassador. He's a career diplomat. He's a different thinker, and there are different thinkers within Itamaraty by all means. But right now, the foreign policy is and trade policy, very ideological, and in point of fact, anti-American. And so she needs to work around that. Lula is in point of fact, and it was his foreign minister who said this to Colin Powell in my presence, that this is the first Brazilian president that arrived with his own foreign policy thinking. And it did not include preconceived notions about the United States. And Neves will certainly have an open mind and proactive on this. And Dilma can too, really, if she wants to engage in practical ways, think outside the box, and look for opportunities for her country.
Thanks, Roger. We're up against our time limit, so let me just conclude by saying that, as Michael pointed out, the election really remains too close to call, so it's kind of pointless to ask for predictions. It's worth noting, however, that Dilma has enjoyed an uptick in the most recent polls, so she appears to be heading into the weekend on a bit of a high note, and you know, that's why they play the game. We'll see what happens on Sunday, and perhaps we'll reconvene at some point in the future to talk about what the implications of the result is. I'd like to thank our panelists, David, Michael, and Roger, for a extremely insightful discussion on the stakes involved, the prospects, and frankly, what it may mean. So if you would join me in a round of applause. Thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule to join us today, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you.